science for more than 5 decades now, I found your presentation to be incomprehensible.
Okay, I'm sorry. Sorry for that.
Okay. And now the good part about it is take your mother-child thing in community, which I think I actually sort of come to that same conclusion myself in a very weaker form, that the women probably are much better at governing than men. But the conclusion would be, okay, take that as an initial premise and now use some logic and use some mathematics and use some creativity to make a nice story.
Yeah, and again, I didn't. Yeah, I'm this will sound defensive. It probably is. I didn't go to the original meeting to be invited to talk, and I usually try to stay off stage as much as possible. I'm an ER physician and a community organizer, and I always work through others. So I try to stay off the stage. But what you're saying is exactly what I am doing, but not with me telling the story, but the people who actually live in neighborhoods. I actually try never to show up on stage, but to help people who are already on stage. So I agree with I think it sounds like we both think that the future of the planet may depend on us paying more attention to mothers and their affection for our children. And again, men can have exactly the same concerns and behaviors, just statistically they don't. So yeah, thanks. And my goal was not to speak at all, but the moderator said, probably people haven't had a chance to listen to it. So your criticism is quite accepted.
Well, I really would just re-emphasize the necessity of having a good story presented from simple premises to the conclusion, step by step, logical, node by node, no big jumps, no big massive emotional swings and this sort of thing, but a nice story.
Yeah, and I think that's what the presentation does. I think that's what it tries to do.
But may I then interrupt also, hopefully not too rude, because I know John Vodonik will also say something. I got exactly what you wanted to say, Mark, and you have been working in the discursive paradigm. And I think the crucial point that you miss, Jerry, is in the abstraction, that is say, at some moment we go to a level of abstraction where we forget we're talking about human being. And so how do you go back to the human being? That's by actually telling stories. And so Mark was, the way I understand, he was trying to get us into the stories. And then he did it in his way. But I saw a very clear logic. And the alternative could have been that he did a lecture on how everyone is abstract and they're all not getting it because they're abstract. But instead of doing that lecture on how everyone else is wrong, he just kind of said, let's go into the stories and see the sort of messages that we get. And either way, Mark, I couldn't resist, but I really appreciate
Very good, very good.
Thank you. That. And
I raise your hand.
Let me another. Fortunately, I grew up in southern Louisiana, and they didn't even know, I don't think, about dyslexia. So no one ever told me I had it, which was a wonderful gift. But I couldn't memorize anything, and I'm a doctor, so you can imagine that presented some problems. And so I've been drawing graphs, since I was in high school, because without a graph, I don't know what I'm talking about. So in a way, I inflicted my learning disability on you, but I do believe. I don't think anyone knows what they're talking about if they can't draw it as a simple graph or a complex graph.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mark.
Oh, yeah. Thanks so much. So, George, I have a question for you. I'm not really clear about your thesis regarding the collapse of civilization. I mean, can you give me a 1 or 2 sentence answer to that? Is it through a lack of leadership, a lack of a misexercise of power? Is it a structural issue for you? What is your thesis with regard to your gloomy? You sound like Malthus. You sound like an economist. Okay, being
no.
gloomy. Well, that's what you sound like. Okay,
What an insult! An ecological economist, maybe.
biophysical economists maybe, but not.
Talk to me then. Talk to me then.
Yeah, it's really very simple. And if you pay attention to energy issues, for example, I'll just use one. There are many. Obviously, the global warming is going to present some real issues, but it takes work to produce wealth. Simple thing. It takes free energy to produce work. And if your free energy per capita is decreasing as it has been since the 1970s, then there's only one end to that. And if you look at, I mean, you might argue, oh, well, what about alternative energies? Well, I've done quite a bit of studying of that issue as well. And they ain't going to replace oil and gas and coal. There's just no way.
So is your thesis, your argument similar to Joe Tainter's argument?
Yeah, very, very similar to Joe. Joe started out on complexity, which would be a governance problem, a lack of sufficient governance. But we come to the same end. I've had quite a few discussions with Joe about this.
Okay, that was my question, because I think that his ideas are just compelling. I mean, I from a historical standpoint, absolutely compelling.
Mm-hmm.
And Mark, a question for you, getting back to my focus in my work, the ethical change of small or human communities. My observation, and the observation not only my own, but that most people believe they're doing the right thing in accordance with the world as they see it, okay? As they see it. So you find a culture that existed in South America, pre-Columbian South America, in which human beings were ritualistically slaughtered. Pretty much a disgusting practice, as far as at least the conquistadores who saw it when that arrived. I mean, they did their own horrible things, but the question is, when we find an ethical conflict in any civilization or any social system, and I define social system as Luhmann does, which is a pattern of correspondence and a pattern of communication and nothing more. The way to deal with that change is to change the language, the discussion that we're having about it, rather than to muscle our way into something. And it comes down to a question of I would agree, storytelling. As you know, I'm a big proponent of storytelling and emotional presentation. You see a little girl starving on the outskirts of Lima, Peru, and you can put your own daughter in that position. You cannot help but stop and feed that child. You can't help but do it. That's all I have to say.
Yeah, and John, there was no question there, but I just want to agree with you. I think that we live in language, and I think I love physics, and I'm a chemist by training, but in the world that I've lived in for the last X number of years, it's about language, and if you can't navigate your world through sophisticated, and I don't mean complex, but correct sets of conversations, things aren't going to turn out well. And stories are the most powerful kind of conversation there is.
Lloyd?
Yeah, I have a similar, a bit of objections and irritations also, that there are grandiose statements which are sometimes normative, sometimes a bit analytical, seldom empirical. And so, for example, if we talk about the evolution of government, then perhaps we should first look at the Roman Empire and how government was different at that time. And then you get periods of high culture, which have a very different government structure than modern governments, because we have the trias politica. So all those issues are then shortcut by saying government is this and this problem, and it is better to go to look at women and to look at mothers. I don't know, that's not empirical. We can make all kinds of statements and keep each other busy with conversations. I think we should try to discipline ourselves and to present ideas in a systematic way and also informed. Okay.
Yeah,
Would you
if I can,
consider this to be empirical?
What
Do you know
is
this
that?
guy? Ian
Who?
Morris?
No.
Ah,
but
well,
I,
look for me on
But
empiricism
for example, if you
when
talk
you know
about
what I've
evolution,
done.
if you talk about evolution, you have to specify what is genotypically evolving.
you know,
I have a whole book on it, like,
but I think what's in front of us is the most interesting opportunity I've seen in a while, given my propensity to overstatement, emotion, and et cetera. I think this question of when and where should we be empirical and reflective and analytical, and when should we essentially study, and then what do you do with it? To me, they are not conflictual. I tend to like to do the studying first, but I don't believe that you get anything done in any world I have ever gotten paid to work in without emotion. In fact, a physician who shows up and is unemotional leaves the patient in limbo. Most patients. So, the question really is, when is it appropriate to be fully human, and when is it appropriate to be really cognitively analytical? And for me, I tend to get them in a particular order, but I definitely know when to jump out of one camp and into another set of behaviors.
So could I ask, how did you come into this particular compartmentalization of your mental processes, of your cognitive processing? Do you think this is part of the dyslexia that you mentioned, which I also suffer from?
Well, I don't know I don't quite understand your question, but I came into pretty much everything I know by following curiosity, and that led me to systems, because I was building systems and needed to know more about them, trauma, first world trauma system, bunch of stuff, community level systems. And then I got into management thinking it was going to be something like medicine, and learned that none of my quite intelligent, affable peers, the vice presidents in a big company, had any scientific understanding of management at all. And, I finally got out of it, but before I discovered Ross Ashby and Stafford Beer. And if I had just known those things, I would have known a lot more about how to think about managing scientifically. So basically, I learned everything the same way, like a frog jumping, across a creek. Just whatever is the next thing I need to know. And of course, I did chemistry and I did medicine, so I'm not incapable of following somebody else's curriculum, but that's not my preferred path.
If I may continue and add something, what I heard in I'm looking for is it George who gave the first presentation?
yes.
Yeah, now I see you again. So you set up evolution, and so I'm trying to maybe connect you all. So Lud, what you're actually saying, we need a model, and if we have a good model, then we can start doing good science, because we know the sorts of questions to ask. And so what George,
Not necessarily that we need
okay,
a model to agree, but people need to talk from a background.
We need to start with the model. So maybe you disagree, and then let's talk about that. I will give a presentation in a couple of weeks, and then you can criticize the assumptions. So we have a model. So George gave us a model of evolution, deep history. And then there was a criticism by Lud, and I think it is because the reality is we have multiple models of evolution. And I think I didn't hear you speak, George, and that's the reason I'm asking about the role of language. Dus we had tools, but at some moment language was developed and the written symbol was developed. the ability to argue came into existence, like understanding the difference between a lie and the truth and how to manipulate. And so I would say, I mean, I'm just curious. Okay, like I show that I think it should be included, but and once we include it in the model, then we kind of see exactly what Mark is trying to get at, that how do we talk to each other, and if it's via abstract concepts, then we stay in the level of the mythical thinking, where there is something mythical that will take care of us all. But if we go to the reality and kind of say, this is the people that we miss, or these are the key people in the network of communication, then we kind of see something. And George, there are two levels of governance, I guess, that evolved, and that's kind of the big question now. One is the top-down model, but the other is of the talking circles and the confederations. And it's being said the Haudenosaunee in the United States, the Iroquois, they have more like you meet in a circle, and it's in many cultures, and even in our Western culture, at the board of directors, they meet in a circle, and they all take turns talking, and then they decide as a small circle. And so that what happened is that concept of the circle has disappeared, or we don't see it as clearly. And instead, it's all about this hierarchical decision making. And then I see an opportunity to connect with Mark's presentation again. There's some people who argue that women are better working in a circle than men. I happen to disagree. I think that's very dangerous, but because men were also doing the circle work, and so, but nevertheless, that Mark is just kind of say maybe women have not been as corrupted with this hierarchical competitive thinking as men, and that's the reason I'm reaching out or giving them a prominent place in my story. So to get it back, George, my question for you is the role of language in your model of deep history.
Well, I borrow my model of the role of language from the paleontologists and anthropologists and so forth, including I can't think. I always run up against this problem whenever I'm pressed to give references. I can't remember names. In any case, the Tomasello. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the work of Tomasello, but basically I've adopted his approach to the evolution of language, having to do with first the rise of individual intentionality, and then dyadic intentionality, and finally group intentionality, and how language actually evolved as a communication process, an increasingly refined communication process, so that people could share what's in their minds with other people. And I agree with you totally. The best model for governance is, the scale is really important. That's why I like Mark's work so much, is because he's on the ground working at the scale where you can actually achieve something. I was referring in this talk, I was referring to governments that started organizing with the development of grain states, and the requirement of those states to manage in a very hierarchical fashion the work that was getting done to support those grain states. So, and unfortunately, language ultimately depends upon the knowledge of the speaker and the listener. You've got to have a framework. You've got to have context. And you've got to understand consequences of
But is language
action.
evolving? Is language evolving? You're making that claim. But if you, for example, look at ancient Greek, you have more expression possibilities in ancient Greek than you have in modern language.
I'm talking
languages.
about the actual biological evolution of language, like not the
So that's languaging. That's not language.
samples of language that exist in societies.
Okay,
So,
okay.
but what does that mean? Why is that evolving? The biological behavior is also the same. If we go back and we would meet people from the Roman times or from the antiquity, we would be able to talk to them.
Well, Klaus has kindly agreed to be our third discussant today. And I think he will address both his opinion about designing the government and also make connections between the topic of critical cybernetics, I mean the critical part cybernetics, with this critical issue of designing government. So Klaus, the floor is yours.
Well, I prepared some slides and so, but I do want to just talk about what I heard. Number one, the abstractions. Where are the abstractions? The abstractions are not in the government. The abstractions are in the language that people are using to construct each other in certain positions. So I think I'm with Jamie that language is important, and whether it's in circle or hierarchy is actually determined in language. It just occurred to me when Lord said something about, or George said something about biological evolution and a biological evolution of language. I think this is crazy. Biology is a discipline that is talked about and written by biologists, and there is no biology of language without the biologists. So I think we should just not get into these abstractions and then think that they take care of us. So that this is just a myth, and I think we have to really look at the kind of phenomena that are negotiated among people, just like Jamie says, and how they organize each other. Now, for me, a social system is not a pattern. For me, a social system is a lot of people that are networked with each other, talk to each other, coordinate their behavior, and language is a very important role, plays a very important role in this. But we should not get into confusing the abstractions with the governing nature. Abstractions don't do anything. They are residing in the language, and people use them in certain ways.
But we also want to see your slides you prepared for today.
Well, there are probably too many, and I decided not. I can put it up, but let me have a few minutes.
No, today we have plenty of time. You see, we only 15 minutes now, so we have more than 1 hour from now on.
I would like to sort of, I don't know where to begin to say that biological evolution has nothing to do with language or whatever point you're trying to make is, I think, nonsense. My intent was to shake things up a little bit, to after watching and listening to folks here for many weeks now, with this, what I'm sorry, but it's a myopic lens that you're using to look at whole system behavior and activity. If you think everything is about cybernetics and language is involved in cybernetics, then you're missing a really huge picture of what's going on in the world. Our civilization is about to collapse. If you don't believe that, I would say you're not really following the news very well, or studying the science.
Or perhaps you don't share all of your beliefs.
It's not, look, we can talk about beliefs all you want, but I'm,
That's all we talk about.
In any system, it's 5 minutes before 12.
All right. So I'll give you the missing link, Klaus. The name is Steven Pinker, who is a very
Yes.
popular psychologist who has been writing a lot of books telling to people that there is something like the biology of language. And so he's kind of mixing a variety of arguments. And I mean, I don't have the list with me, but you can look up his name, it starts by the blank slate, the language instinct, now our better angels. I mean, but he all goes back to there is another important one that I missed, but is basically setting up evolutionary epistemology as the discipline that will make all the connections. And now I think it's an established disciplines and there's psychology books on evolutionary epistemology. And I agree with you that they miss something very important about how language actually works. I'm in 100% agreement with you, Klaus, and I'm here because I want to do something about it. I mean, to kind of in response to George Merbus, I mean, I think just it is 5 for 12, and it is the intellectuals who have brought us here, not the general masses, but the intellectuals who have skipped over a couple of very critical, important distinctions that I think Klaus has very clearly shown in his presentations. It's how we argue with each other, and I think that's the great opportunity for cybernetics with the word cyber steering, that we can help steer each other to become more sensitive to all the blind spots that we may create in how we argue, and that we actually get closer to midnight.
I happen to have read that book, Steven Pinker's book, and
Yeah.
it is about how people make pidgin languages and etc. etc. It's about the morphogenesis of language. So it is no longer, when you compare, for example, Swedish with Dutch or English or whatever, that's a different stage. It has to do with how language emerges, morphogenesis, and that's something different from the evolution.
Could I just jump in there and say something quickly about both of the speakers? I enjoyed both approaches. The problem I had slightly with both approaches was this concept that we can design a new governance system. Having experience like Mark, total failure in change management, the fact that you set out to achieve something fails to understand that you're normally sitting in the meta system and you're looking at the emergent properties of the system underneath. And the fact that both of the speakers George suggested that command and control has steered the world. I don't think that's the true. I think the example I would quote was Donald Trump, who once asked when he had to do something, said, "I can't do that, my base wouldn't let me." And you have to ask who was in charge. The idea that he had command and control of a group of people, it was a complex feedback loop. And what we're looking at in complexity of the world is areas where we have achieved autopoiesis and stability, and people hang on to that because they need stability. So there is a great reluctance to want to shift from a system that you think is stable. And the problem is, it's not about design, it's about a process. I see Richard is sitting there with a process on the screen behind him. And it's more, I think we should be not talking more about the model, we should be talking about the process. And I would argue that some of those who've been talking about language are trying to do just that. But my argument is that it's when we start arguing about language, for me, the important part of language is narrative. And narrative I would describe as viable language, in that it brings together ideas with cohesion and coherence in a way that humans seem to tune into. And it actually, what it is doing, in my belief, is constructing a model A narrative is quite interesting because the anthropologists would say it has to have several factors. One is it describes a thing called prototypicality, which comes from Wittgenstein, where we talk about family resemblance. It doesn't categorize, it merely shows a sort of prototype. But it also tends to abstract out of time. So a lot of narrative removes the actual time. So if you look at a lot of things that are happening in Britain or America, they're reinventing a time in the past because it's easier to fit abstract ideas into something that isn't true. So you have to watch out for narrative, as it has many pitfalls as you try to construct an understanding of the world. And the suggestion I would make is that moving forward with governance is not about trying to design a model, it's designing a process. And the key to that process is adaptability. You have to recognize when it doesn't work and move and change. So you have to tackle people's belief systems as the most fundamental things, because that's what people will hang on to grim death. That's all.
Thanks.
Excellent.
Yes, Klaus.
Well, I just